He was 19, with nothing to his name but a duffel bag and a final notice from his university dorm. When a lawyer's letter informed him that his estranged grandmother had died, it left him with a single key to a house no one had entered in years, a place that held the truth about why he'd been left behind in the first place. What he discovered there would change everything. If you've ever felt like you were starting from absolute zero, with the whole world feeling like a closed door, then you know the feeling I'm talking about. Stick with me through this, and if any of it resonates, maybe it's for stories like ours, the ones that don't always start easy. The bus seat vibrated with a low, insistent hum, a rhythm that had been shaking my bones for the last 4 hours. Outside, the gray sky wept a miserable drizzle against the window, blurring the already unfamiliar landscape of scrubby pines and tired-looking fields. Each town we passed through was smaller than the last, a collection of fading storefronts and quiet houses that seemed to be holding their breath. I was holding mine, too. In my pocket, my fingers worried the cold, ornate brass of a key. It felt heavier than it should, like it was forged from the weight of a life I had never known. Beside it was a folded, creased letter from a man named Arthur Gable, attorney at law. The letter was formal, sparse on detail, heavy on implications. It informed me of the passing of Evelyn Reed, my maternal grandmother. It also informed me that I was her sole heir. Heir to what, it didn't say. Just a key and an address in a town called Havenwood, a place I'd only ever seen as a name on my birth certificate. For 19 years, the story I knew was simple and sharp. My mother had died when I was a baby, and my grandmother, for reasons no one ever bothered to explain, had given me over to the state. I'd spent my life in a constellation of foster homes, a satellite in other families' orbits, never quite landing. College was supposed to be my escape, my launch into a real life. But 2 years in, the scholarships had dried up, the part-time job wasn't enough, and my grades had slipped under the pressure of trying to stay afloat. The final notice from student housing had been polite but firm. I had 72 hours to vacate. I had spent the first 48 in a state of numb panic, couch surfing with acquaintances who were already counting the minutes until I left. Then the letter from Mr. Gable had arrived at my last known address, forwarded by a social worker who still occasionally checked in on me. It felt less like a lifeline and more like a ghost story I was being forced to walk into. The bus hissed to a stop at a desolate-looking station that was little more than a covered bench and a signpost. Havenwood, population 1,243. The air that hit me as I stepped off was different. It was thick with the smell of damp earth, wet pine, and something else, something old and quiet. It was the smell of a place that time was trying its best to forget. The law office of Arthur Gable was a short walk away, situated on a main street that looked like a movie set from the 1970s. The paint was peeling on most of the buildings, but the windows were clean. It was a town holding on to its dignity with both hands. Mr. Gable's office was above a hardware store, up a narrow flight of stairs that creaked with every step. The man himself matched the office perfectly, worn, tidy, and smelling faintly of old paper and coffee. He was older, with thin gray hair and glasses that sat low on his nose. He looked at me over the rims, his expression not unkind, but deeply weary, as if he'd seen 1,000 kids like me walk through his door, all of them carrying a different version of the same baggage. "Mr. Reed?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle. He gestured to a worn leather chair. I sat. The duffel bag at my feet contained everything I owned. "It's Alex," I said. He nodded slowly, shuffling a thin file on his desk. Alex, right. I was your grandmother's lawyer for nearly 30 years. I'm sorry for your loss. The words felt hollow. How do you mourn someone who was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost? Thank you, I mumbled. Evelyn was a complicated woman, he said, choosing his words with care. She was very private, kept to herself, especially these last few decades. He slid a document across the desk. This is the deed. The property is yours, free and clear, legally speaking. I looked at the address. 14 Ravenwood Lane. The house? And the 40 acres it sits on, he confirmed. He then slid another stack of papers over. These were thicker, bound with a rubber band. These are the realities of the situation. There are significant back taxes owed. The town has been patient, mostly because of me, but their patience is running out. The house itself, well, it hasn't been maintained in a very long time. It's not habitable by any legal definition. My stomach sank. A house I couldn't live in and a debt I couldn't pay. This wasn't a lifeline, it was an anchor. So what am I supposed to do? I asked, the question coming out smaller and more desperate than I'd intended. Mr. Gable leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. There is an option, a standing offer, in fact. He pulled a third, much sleeker-looking folder from a drawer. The logo on the front was a stylized green leaf with the words Viridian Holdings underneath. They're a development corporation. They've been trying to buy up land in this county for years. They want your grandmother's property for a new resort project. They've been after it for a long time. She always refused to sell. He opened the folder. Their offer is generous. More than generous, frankly, given the state of the place. It would pay off the tax debt 10 times over and leave you with enough to start a new life. A real one. New town, back to college, whatever you want. He slid the offer sheet across the desk. The number printed at the bottom made my head spin. It was more money than I had ever imagined seeing in one place. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card. It was an escape. Why are they offering so much for a ruin? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Gable sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Location, access to the lake, and persistence. They want it. Your grandmother was the last holdout on this side of the county. With her gone, they see their chance. He looked at me, his gaze direct and serious. My official advice, Alex, as the executor of this estate, is to take the money. Sign the papers, walk away, and don't look back. This place, this town, this house, it's a burden. Your grandmother wouldn't have wanted you to carry it. The words hung in the air between us. A burden, just like the system had always considered me. A case file to be managed, a problem to be solved. And here was the ultimate solution, a signature, an easy out. But as I looked at the key sitting on the corner of the desk, I felt a strange, stubborn pull. Before I could sign away the only thing that had ever truly belonged to me, I had to see it. I had to stand in the place where my story began, even if it was also where it was meant to end. I want to see the house first, I said. Mr. Gable's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Respect? Or maybe just pity? All right, son, he said, nodding slowly. I'll have Mary from the diner give you a ride out there. She heads that way after her shift. But you should know, there's no power, no water. You can't stay there. I nodded. even though I knew he was wrong. It was the only place in the world I had left to go. Mary was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my favorite high school librarian. She sized me up with a single glance as I climbed into her dusty pickup truck. She didn't ask many questions, for which I was grateful. The silence in the cab was comfortable, filled only by the rattle of the engine and the swish of the wipers. We drove out of the small town center, and the houses grew farther apart, replaced by dense woods that crowded the edges of the road. The drizzle had softened into a fine mist that hung in the air, making the trees look like gray phantoms. "You're Evelyn's boy," she said after a few miles, not as a question, but as a statement. "Grandson," I corrected gently. "Right." She chewed on her lip for a moment. She kept to herself. A lot of folks thought she was odd, but she always paid cash at the diner, and she'd leave a whole $1 for a coffee. Tipped well. It was a small thing, but it was the first human detail I had ever heard about my grandmother. Not a ghost, not a file, but a woman who drank coffee and tipped well. We turned off the main road onto a gravel track that was barely more than 2 ruts in the mud. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. The lane climbed steadily, winding deeper into the woods. It felt like we were leaving the 21st century behind. After another 5 minutes of crawling along the overgrown path, Mary pulled the truck to a stop. "This is as far as I can go," she said, gesturing ahead. "The lane's washed out up there. It's another 1/4-mile walk." I grabbed my duffel bag from the truck bed. "Thank you, Mary, for the ride." She gave me a long, searching look. It was full of a sad sort of pity. "You be careful now. That place has been empty a long time. Critters and rot, you know. Arthur Gable's right. There's nothing for you here." She hesitated, then reached into a bag on the seat beside her and pulled out a paper-wrapped bundle. "Here, ham and cheese. You look like you could use it." Before I could properly thank her, she put the truck in reverse and began the slow, careful process of backing down the lane. I stood there, a sandwich in one hand and my life in a bag in the other, and watched until the red of her taillights disappeared into the mist. Then I was alone. The silence that descended was absolute. It was a living thing, broken only by the drip of water from the leaves and the sound of my own breathing. I turned and started walking. The lane was slick with wet leaves, and the air grew colder as I climbed. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw it. The house. It wasn't a mansion in the way you see in movies, all gleaming spires and manicured lawns. This was something older, wilder. It was a large, 2-story Victorian farmhouse, but it was in a state of profound decay. The paint had been scoured away by decades of wind and rain, leaving the wood a silvery, splintered gray. The porch roof sagged dangerously in the middle, held up by what looked like sheer force of will. Most of the windows on the ground floor were boarded up, dark and blind. Ivy had crawled up one entire side of the house, its green tentacles prying at the siding and reaching for the roof. It looked less like a building and more like a shipwreck, a great wooden vessel that had run aground on this lonely hill and been slowly dismantled by the sea of time. It should have been terrifying. It should have felt like the final, crushing confirmation that I had inherited nothing but a ruin. But as I stood there, the mist swirling around my ankles, I felt something else. A strange sense of recognition. The house was wounded, forgotten, fighting a slow, losing battle against the elements. It was a perfect reflection of how I felt inside. It was broken, and it was mine. I walked up the 3 stone steps to the porch, testing each one before putting my full weight on it. The wood of the porch floor groaned under my boots, but held. The front door was massive, made of dark, heavy oak, with a tarnished brass mail slot and a large keyhole. I pulled the key from my pocket. Its ornate design matched the lock. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand hovering. This was it, the threshold, the dividing line between the life I had known, a life of temporary rooms and borrowed spaces, and whatever this was. I took a deep breath that tasted of rain and decay, and I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a surprisingly smooth, deep thud, the sound of a well-made mechanism waking from a long sleep. The door swung inward on silent hinges, opening into darkness. The air that rolled out to meet me was thick and cold, carrying the scent of 100 years of dust, dry rot, and trapped memories. I stepped inside and pulled the heavy door closed behind me, shutting out the gray light of the afternoon. For a moment, I was in complete blackness, my eyes struggling to adjust. Slowly, shapes began to resolve themselves from the gloom. I was in a grand entryway. A wide, sweeping staircase rose into the shadows of the second floor. To my left and right were archways leading into other rooms. Everything, absolutely everything, was covered in a pale gray shroud of dust. And draped over every piece of furniture were white cloths, making the room look like it was populated by a silent congregation of ghosts. I moved forward cautiously, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floors. I pulled the sheet off the nearest shape. It was a grand piano, its wood dark and rich under the dust. I gently touched one of the keys. It produced a single, discordant, mournful note that hung in the dead air for a long time. It was the first sound the house had made in years. I walked into the room on the left. It was a library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were packed with books, their spines faded and brittle. A thick layer of dust lay over everything, a soft gray snow that had fallen uninterrupted for decades. In the center of the room were 2 large armchairs facing a massive stone fireplace, a silent conversation suspended in time. I ran my finger along a shelf, leaving a dark streak in the dust. The titles were classics: Dickens, Austen, Tolstoy. My grandmother had been a reader, another small piece of her, dislodged from the past. I explored the rest of the downstairs, a formal dining room with a table long enough for 20 guests, a kitchen with an ancient-looking cast-iron stove and countertops of thick butcher-block wood. Everything was of a quality I'd never seen before. This hadn't just been a house. It had been a home, built with care and meant to last. But it was also a museum of abandonment. In the kitchen, a calendar on the wall was turned to October 1998. A newspaper on the table was dated the same week. It was like the occupant had simply vanished. My heart ached with a question that had no answer. Why? Why leave all this? Why leave me? Upstairs, the story was the same. 4 large bedrooms, each with its own fireplace, all shrouded and silent. But the last room at the end of the hall was different. Its door was closed, and it was the only one that was locked. There was no keyhole, just a heavy, modern-looking deadbolt that had been installed long after the house was built. It was out of place, a scar of modernity on the old wood. I rattled the knob, pushed against the door with my shoulder. It was solid, unmoving. Whatever was in that room was meant to stay there. My curiosity, already a burning ember, now flared into a small fire. What was she hiding? I spent the next hour searching the other rooms for a key, a clue, anything. I checked under dusty carpets, in the drawers of creaking dressers, inside forgotten porcelain vases. Nothing. The sun was beginning to set, and the light filtering through the grimy windows was turning a bruised purple. The house was growing colder, the shadows deepening and stretching like grasping fingers. I was tired, hungry, and my hope was beginning to fade, replaced by the familiar gnawing of despair. Maybe Mary and Mr. Gable were right. There was nothing for me here but ghosts and questions. I sat down on the top step of the main staircase, my head in my hands. The sandwich Mary had given me was a lump in my jacket pocket. I should eat it. I should find a place on the floor to unroll my sleeping bag. I should try to survive the night. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't a key. It was a flicker of light, a small reflection from the far wall of the entryway, just below the staircase. The setting sun, for a brief moment, had hit a piece of glass in just the right way to catch my eye. I got up and walked down the stairs, my boots echoing in the vast silence. Tucked away in the dark space under the stairs, almost completely obscured by shadow, was a small framed photograph hanging on the wall. It was a picture of a young woman with a laughing smile, holding a baby, my mother, and me. My breath caught in my throat. I had only ever seen one other photo of her, a grainy photocopy in my file. This one was clear, vibrant. She looked so happy. I reached out and touched the glass. The frame felt loose. I tilted it slightly, and it swung away from the wall, revealing that it was hinged. Behind it was a small, dark cavity, a hidden safe. And on the front of the safe was a simple 4-digit combination dial. I stared at it, my mind racing. A combination, a date, an address? I tried my birthday. Nothing. I tried the year the house was built, which was carved into the mantelpiece in the library. Nothing. I felt a surge of frustration. It was right there, another locked door standing between me and the truth. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the wall, defeated. I looked back at the photo of my mother. Her smile was so bright. I looked at the date on the newspaper in the kitchen again in my mind. October 1998, the month she died. What was the exact date? I didn't know. No one had ever told me. It was just a detail in a file. I slid down to sit on the floor, my back against the wall, and pulled out the only official document I had with my mother's name on it. My own birth certificate, which Mr. Gable had given me with the deed. I unfolded the worn paper, and there it was, my mother's birthday, June 10th, 0610. My heart started pounding. It was a long shot, a desperate guess. I reached into the cavity and my fingers found the cold metal dial. I turned it slowly, carefully. Click. 6. Click. 1. Click. 0. I paused, then turned the handle. There was a loud, satisfying clunk as the tumblers released. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside the safe, there was no money, no jewelry. There was just a small, lacquered wooden box and a single, small, iron key. The key for the room upstairs. I took the box out. It was beautiful, inlaid with mother of pearl in the shape of a raven. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were two things. a thick stack of envelopes, bound with a silk ribbon, and a small, leather-bound journal. The top envelope was addressed in elegant, looping handwriting. To my grandson, Alex. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. This was it. This was the voice I had been waiting my whole life to hear. I untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The paper was thick and creamy, and the ink was a faded blue. "My dearest Alex," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has finally delivered you back to me, to this house. I know you will have questions. I know you have likely spent your life believing I abandoned you. Nothing could be further from the truth. I did not abandon you, my child. I protected you, and I have been waiting for you to come home ever since." I had to stop reading. A wave of emotion so powerful it felt like a physical blow crashed over me. Grief, anger, confusion, and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. I sank to the floor, the letters clutched in my hand, and in the dusty, silent hall of that forgotten house, I finally cried. I cried for the little boy who believed he was unwanted. I cried for the young man who felt utterly alone. And I cried for the grandmother I had never known, a woman who had apparently loved me all along. The sun had set completely now, plunging the house into a profound darkness. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. The letters in my hand felt like a lantern, and I had a feeling they were about to illuminate everything. I want to pause here for a second, because this was the moment everything I thought I knew about my life was turned completely upside down. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where the story you've been telling yourself, the one that defines who you are, just shatters into a million pieces. It's terrifying, but it's also a chance. It's a chance to pick up the pieces and start writing a new one. If you're on a journey like that, trying to make sense of a past you didn't choose, I see you. We see you in this community. Let your own story. It's not an easy thing to do, but you're not doing it alone. Now, let's get back to that dusty floor. I sat there for what felt like hours, the cool of the wood seeping into my bones, reading my grandmother's words by the weak beam of the flashlight I'd had in my bag. Each letter was a piece of a puzzle I never knew existed. She wrote about my mother, her daughter, with a fierce, aching love. She wrote about my birth, the joy it brought to this old house. And then she wrote about the darkness that followed. My grandfather, it turned out, had not been a simple farmer. He had been a brilliant botanist and a businessman who, with two partners, had started a company based on his research into rare medicinal plants found on their land. That company had grown, become successful, and eventually it became Viridian Holdings. But his partners, ambitious and ruthless men, had wanted more. They had pushed him out, using legal tricks and financial loopholes to steal his research, his patents, and his shares. They had left him with nothing but this house and this land. The fight had broken him. He had died of a heart attack a year later, a man defeated by greed. That greed hadn't ended with his death. Viridian Holdings knew the land itself was valuable, not just for development, but because of the unique ecosystem my grandfather had cultivated. They wanted it. They had harassed my grandmother for years, first with lowball offers, then with legal threats. When my mother got pregnant with me, the threats escalated. They became personal, ugly. They saw a single mother as a weak link, an easy target. The final letter in the stack was dated the week after my mother's car accident. It was a sterile, typed letter from Viridian's legal department, offering their deepest condolences and a new final offer to buy the property, to alleviate her financial and emotional burdens. They thought they had me, Alex, she wrote. They thought a grieving mother, now with a baby to care for, would break. And I almost did. I looked at you, so small, so perfect, and I knew I couldn't protect you here. Not from them. They were not good people. They would have used you as leverage. They would have made our lives a living hell until I gave them what they wanted. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I gave you up. I put you into a system that, for all its flaws, would keep you anonymous, safe, away from their reach. And then I built a fortress around myself. I cut myself off from the town. I let the house fall into disrepair. I cultivated a reputation as a crazy, bitter old recluse who would rather let her family legacy rot than sell it. I made this land and myself seem worthless. It was the only way I knew to keep it safe for you. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. It was all a lie. The abandonment, the neglect. It was a strategy, a sacrifice, a long, lonely, 30-year war fought by a woman I had never met. She hadn't left me a ruin. She had left me a fortress, waiting for its rightful heir. The anger I felt toward Viridian Holdings was a white-hot fire in my chest. They hadn't just stolen a company. They had stolen my family. They had stolen my life. I looked at the iron key in my hand, the key to the locked room. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that whatever was in that room was the ammunition she had left me. I stood up, my body stiff from the cold floor, and walked up the creaking staircase, my flashlight beam cutting a path through the darkness. I put the key in the deadbolt. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I pushed the door open. The room wasn't a bedroom. It was an office. A large oak desk stood in the center, and the walls were lined not with bookshelves, but with filing cabinets. A thick, organized layer of dust covered everything, but it was clear this room had been a place of purpose. On the desk sat an old desktop computer, the kind with a big, boxy monitor. Beside it was a single, sealed manila envelope. My name was written on it. Inside was the final letter. Alex, if you have made it this far, then you are stronger than I could have ever hoped. In this room is everything I gathered over 30 years. Every threatening letter from Viridian, every crooked contract, every piece of evidence of their fraud. I hired private investigators. I spoke to disgruntled former employees. It's all here, in these cabinets and on this computer. There is a generator in the barn out back. The gas for it is in the shed. The password for the computer is the name of the boat your grandfather and I sailed on our honeymoon, the Starlight. You have two choices now. In the bottom drawer of the desk, you will find a bank book for an account I opened in your name the day you were born. I put money in it every single month. It's not a fortune, but it's enough. It's enough for you to take all this evidence, give it to Arthur Gable, and let him secure a settlement from Viridian. They will pay dearly to make this go away quietly. You could take that money and the offer they already made for the land, and you could disappear. You could live a safe, comfortable life and never have to think about this place, or them, ever again. That is a valid choice. After the life you've had, no one would blame you for wanting peace. Or you can stay. You can use the money in the account to pay the taxes. You can use this evidence not as a bargaining chip, but as a weapon. You can fight them. Not for money, but for justice. For your grandfather. For your mother. You can take back the home they tried to steal from us. It is the harder path, Alex. It will be a long, ugly fight. But this house is more than wood and nails. It is our story. It is your birthright. The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, know that I have always loved you. Your grandmother, Evelyn. I slowly lowered the letter. The weight of it all, the sheer scale of her love and her fight, was staggering. I walked to the desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. There was the bank book. I opened it. The final balance was well over $50,000, enough to pay the taxes, fix the roof, and live for a year. Enough to start the fight. I looked around the dusty office, at the rows of filing cabinets that held a lifetime of my grandmother's quiet war. I thought about the offer from Viridian, the millions of dollars that could wipe away all my problems. I could walk away, be free. But it wouldn't be freedom, would it? It would be an escape, paid for by my grandmother's sacrifice, my mother's memory, my grandfather's legacy. It would be letting them win. I walked over to the window and looked out. The moon had risen, casting a pale, ethereal light over the overgrown grounds. The mist had cleared, and I could see the dark, sleeping shape of the lake in the distance. This was my land. This was my home. And for the first time, I knew what I had to do. I pulled out my phone. The battery was at 5%, but I had a signal. I found the number for Arthur Gable's office on the letterhead he'd given me. I prayed he was working late. It rang 3 times, and then his weary voice answered. "Gable? Mr. Gable, it's Alex Reed." There was a pause. "Alex, are you all right? I was worried when I didn't hear from you." "I'm fine," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than I'd ever heard it. "I'm more than fine. I'm calling to tell you I've made a decision. I'm not selling." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "Son, we talked about this. The taxes, the state of the—" "I can pay the taxes," I interrupted. "My grandmother, she left me everything I need. And Mr. Gable, we're not just going to refuse their offer. We're going to fight them. She left evidence, 30 years worth." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely different. The weariness was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused energy. There was something else, too, a warmth. "I see," he said softly. "She finally told you." "You knew?" I asked, stunned. "I knew she was collecting things. I knew she had her reasons for how she lived. She was the most stubborn, brilliant, and loyal person I have ever known. She made me promise not to interfere. She said her grandson had to find his own way to the truth and make his own choice." He cleared his throat. "I was hoping you'd make this one, kid. I was really hoping." "So you'll help me?" I heard the sound of a drawer opening, of papers being shuffled. "Help you? Alex, I've been waiting 30 years for this phone call. You get that generator running and you start figuring out what you've got. I'll be out there first thing in the morning, and we, son, are going to give them hell." When I hung up the phone, the last of the battery died, plunging the room into darkness again. But this time, the darkness was my own. It felt calm, protective. I wasn't a lost boy anymore. I was a grandson. I had a history, I had a home, and I had a war to win. The next few months were a blur of hard work and small victories. The first order of business was getting the generator from the barn running. It was an old, beastly thing, but after cleaning the plugs and filling it with the fresh gas my grandmother had left, it roared to life with a plume of blue smoke. I ran a thick extension cord into the office and fired up the old computer. The screen flickered, and then a password prompt appeared. I typed, "Starlight." Access granted. The files were meticulously organized. Decades of Viridian's internal communications, acquired through sources I could only guess at. Scanned copies of my grandfather's original contracts, annotated with notes detailing the fraud. Financial records, depositions from former employees who'd been cheated or fired. and a folder of audio files. The first one I clicked on was a recorded phone call. A nervous-sounding man was detailing to my grandmother how the company partners had systematically forged my grandfather's signature on documents signing away his patent rights. It was a smoking gun. It was dynamite. Mr. Gable arrived the next morning as promised, his old sedan bouncing up the rutted lane. When he saw the office, he just stood in the doorway and shook his head in amazement. "That woman," he whispered. "She never did anything by halves." We spent the next week combing through everything. Gable, with his lawyer's eye, sorted the documents into piles: evidence, leverage, background. I spent hours scanning and backing up every file from the old computer onto a modern laptop he brought me. It was grueling work, but with every document we cataloged, I felt a piece of my family's story being reclaimed. We weren't victims anymore. We were building a case. While Gable began drafting the initial legal filings, I turned my attention to the house itself. Using the money from the account Evelyn had left me, I paid the back taxes in full at the town hall. The clerk, a woman who had looked at me with pity just days before, now looked at me with a new respect. The news spread through Havenwood like wildfire. Evelyn Reed's boy wasn't selling. He was staying. The house was a monumental task. I started with the basics. I cleared the overgrown vegetation from around the foundation. I patched the leaky roof with tar and plywood, a skill I learned from watching videos on my phone. I tore the rotten boards off the windows and let the sunlight stream in for the first time in a generation. Each task was physically exhausting. I ended every day covered in dirt and sweat, my muscles aching. But it was a good ache. It was the feeling of building something, not just being pushed along by circumstances. I was putting my own energy, my own sweat, into the foundations of my new life. The community, which had at first held me at arm's length, began to thaw. Mary from the diner started dropping off hot meals once a week. An old man named Hank, a retired carpenter who lived down the road, showed up one afternoon with his toolbox. "Your grandmother once paid me to fix her barn roof when I was having a hard time," he said, his voice gruff. "Never forgot it. Figured I'd see if her grandson needed a hand with these window frames." He stayed for the rest of the day, teaching me how to properly set a pane of glass. Others followed. People started sharing stories about my grandmother, small acts of kindness she had performed in secret, never wanting any recognition. They hadn't seen a crazy recluse. They had seen a private woman who had her own burdens, but who still looked out for her neighbors. They were reclaiming her memory, just as I was reclaiming her home. The response from Viridian Holdings was swift and predictable. A team of lawyers from the city sent Gable a cease and desist letter, calling our claims baseless and defamatory. Then, a sleek black car with tinted windows appeared in town, its occupants asking questions about me. They were trying to intimidate me, to paint me as an opportunistic kid trying to cash in. But it didn't work. I wasn't alone anymore. When the city lawyers tried to question Mary at the diner, she told them to leave, backed up by two burly loggers having their morning coffee. Havenwood was a small town, but it was starting to feel like my town. They were closing ranks. Gable filed our lawsuit. It wasn't for money. It was a suit to formally invalidate the original contracts that had stolen my grandfather's company, citing fraud and coercion. We also filed an injunction to halt Viridian's planned resort development, arguing that the land had been acquired under false pretenses from other local families using similar predatory tactics. We leaked the story, along with a few key pieces of non-critical evidence, to a state newspaper journalist Gable knew. The headline was explosive. Billion-dollar corporation Viridian Holdings accused of fraud by founder's grandson. The fallout was immediate. Viridian's stock took a hit. The other families who had sold their land to them under pressure started talking to lawyers. We had turned their strategy of quiet intimidation into a very loud, very public problem. A few weeks later, their lead counsel called Mr. Gable. They wanted to settle. We met in Gable's small, dusty office. 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits sat across from me and my small-town attorney. They looked uncomfortable, out of place. They offered money, a lot of money, more than their original offer for the land. I looked at Mr. Gable. He gave me a slight nod. The choice was mine. "The money isn't the point," I said, my voice steady. "I want 3 things. First, a public statement from your company acknowledging the unethical business practices that led to my grandfather's removal and a formal apology to my family. Second, you will fund the creation of the Evelyn Reed Conservation Trust, an organization dedicated to preserving the wilderness on the north side of the lake, managed by a board of local citizens. You will provide its initial endowment. And third, you will relinquish any and all claims to my property and the adjacent lands, forever." The lead lawyer stared at me, his jaw tight. I could see him calculating. A public apology was poison to their brand. But a protracted public court battle, with the evidence we had, would be far worse. He looked at his partners. He sighed. "We accept your terms." I walked out of that office and into the bright afternoon sun. It felt like I was breathing for the first time. It wasn't a total victory. The men who had wronged my family were still rich. The company still existed. But it was justice. It was our story, told and acknowledged. My grandmother's name would be on a trust dedicated to protecting the land she loved. That was a better legacy than any amount of money. Months turned into a year. The settlement was finalized. The trust was established. The work on the house continued. Hank the carpenter became a regular presence, and with his guidance, I learned to restore the sagging porch, refinish the hardwood floors, and rebuild the crumbling fireplaces. The house was slowly coming back to life, breathing again. It was no longer a ruin or a fortress. It was becoming a home. My home. I'm standing on the porch now, leaning against a newly painted railing. The evening sun is filtering through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the lawn I painstakingly cleared and reseeded. The air smells of fresh-cut grass and lake water. Inside, the lights are on, casting a warm golden glow from the windows. It's not a perfect house. The floors still creak, and there are 100 more projects to do. But every flaw, every repaired board, is a part of my story. My grandmother left me more than a house. She left me a choice. I could have chosen the easy path, taken the money and vanished into a comfortable, anonymous life. But in choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, I found something much more valuable than money. I found a connection to my past. I found a community. I found a purpose. I found myself. This house, this land, taught me that some things, and some people, can look broken from the outside, scarred and neglected. But they're not worthless. They're just waiting. Waiting for someone to come along who is willing to do the work, to look past the dust and the decay, and see the strength and beauty that lies beneath. Maybe you have a broken house in your life right now, a dream you've given up on, a relationship that feels like it's in ruins, a part of yourself you've boarded up and hidden away. Don't let anyone convince you it's a lost cause. What I learned here, on this lonely hill, is that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you build, with your own two hands. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you even a small piece of hope for whatever you're building in your own life, please consider subscribing and joining our community here. We're all just trying to restore the things that matter. And I'm building right now. What broken thing are you trying to make whole again? I promise you,